everybody, and welcome to this episode of WhatTheHell.Dev. Today we are talking to Alex Eagle, and he is going to tell us what the hell Bazel is. And so I'm very excited, Alex, for you to just even, what is Bazel? What's going on?
When I agreed to appear on this podcast, I thought it was WhatTheHeck.Dev. I didn't realize it had sort of a demonic attribute to it. Are you sure that's okay?
I tried to buy WTF.dev, but that was taken. So this is actually like the dumbed down version of what,
Okay, so you're saying it could be worse.
It could be worse. Yeah.
Okay. So what the heck is Bazel? Bazel is a build tool that is similar to Gulp or Grunt, if you've used those, in the sense that it coordinates the other tools that you're running. It knows when to run TypeScript or Parcel or Webpack or Cypress or fill in another 100 tools here that belong in the front-end ecosystem. But unlike Gulp and Grunt, Bazel understands how to break up your build into lots of little pieces and then run those pieces in parallel and cache the results, and maybe even use hundreds of machines in the cloud to parallelize the workload of doing your build and test. And so especially if you have slow round-trip time on your CI, or if you're an enterprise that has a really large application that takes way too long to build, then you want a build tool that is able to do these incremental builds. You make a small change, and there should be a small amount of work to do to get your output directory up to date again. And going past that, Bazel can, since it's not a front-end specific tool, can also build your back-end code, your APIs. It can do your deployments. And so really you end up with one tool that all the developers in your whole organization need to use to do all their build, test, and deploy. So that has a lot of value also in terms of making things uniform.
So I guess one of my questions would be, which I don't know if you get this question a lot, but I would assume you do. It's, is it just like Webpack?
So Webpack is many things. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Webpack is a build system, and in that sense, yeah, if you were to have Bazel first compile your TypeScript code and then hand the resulting JavaScript to a bundler, you don't need Webpack to do that part anymore. And so you wouldn't need a TypeScript loader inside of Webpack. You still need something to do bundling and optimizing of JavaScript, and Webpack is great at doing that. So what we're talking about is really and Webpack is not the only build tool that has this problem. Every bundler, dev server, or testing tool in the front-end ecosystem today has to know how to build all of your sources from the original, from what you typed, which means that all of them have become this sort of monolith that includes being a build system as well as everything else, using a bunch of plugins. And so you have you end up with this ecosystem where things have to be written many times. I was looking at how do I run Vue, and if you're running Vue under Webpack, that's fine because that's what the Vue team supports. But if you want to run it under Rollup, it seems like, there's a different contributed reimplementation of the Vue compiler that runs under Rollup. And if you're using some third tool that's not Webpack or Rollup, then there's nothing for you. And so the fact that you have to have every tool has to understand every language or everything that requires tooling that you might use in your app is kind of a design smell.
And so, in terms of...
Sorry, interrupting. That's okay. We're doing some question and answer right now, and Tracy's recording it, just so you know.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
So another question would be, let's say, what is the audience? What is the demographic for Bazel? Is it, I know, you guys are very enterprise focused, but, as JavaScript continuously evolves and JavaScript developers continuously need to figure out how to be the best developer there is out there, should they really be starting to look at Bazel as, hey, here's all the tools, just use this thing, and it will deal with all the things that you need to do instead of stitching all these different things in the ecosystem together? Is that where Bazel's trying to go?
Not necessarily. If you're a typical front-end developer, then your use case is probably pretty well satisfied by just you use the CLI that comes with the framework that you're using, and you have no idea how any of the build tooling works, and that's fine. that the build tooling in a small application like that probably satisfies your needs. And so no, you shouldn't do something that's not idiomatic in the ecosystem where you're working. And a lot of tools in the JavaScript ecosystem do a great job of giving you sort of a zero config off the ground experience, like Parcel just looks at your application and just figures out what to do. So no, those things I think serve their ecosystems pretty well. And at best, Bazel will do the same thing as that for a small application, which is to say, if Bazel could be zero config and just look at your sources and understand what to do, which we're working to give it more of those capabilities. But like the best it could do is then it would just run Parcel the same way it does today, or whatever bundler you're using. So no, the audience that we're approaching right now is the audience who's not satisfied with those tools the way they are today, and that's either because number one, they are operating at a scale where it's too slow and they need something like parallelization and incrementality in their build, or it's because they want to have a build and test that includes more than just their front end. So, for example, if you have an API and you want to make a change to the schema for the API, like using Swagger or GraphQL to define what the API methods look like, you want to be able to type check whether that change works for both the front end and the back end. And so you want to be able to write an integration test that says, okay, am I able to compile the Java backend and the TypeScript front end, and do they work together if I make the following change? So in order to write that kind of integration test or have the kind of full stack build, test, and deploy story, obviously that's also not satisfied by any of the tools in the JavaScript ecosystem because they don't know how to run the Java compiler.
So would you say that your target demographic isn't the front-end developer then? It's going to be more of the DevOps type person? Or is the DevOps person going to look at Bazel and just be like, oh, well, I already know how to do that. I don't need a tool. Like,
a DevOps person probably does know how to stitch together all of the raw off-the-shelf tools like the TypeScript compiler if you were just to run the CLI that the TypeScript team ships. If you knew how to stitch that together with the other tools that are required to make your application build and test, then yeah, you're sort of a build system engineer is one of your hats. And in that case, you would understand immediately what Bazel is and why it's useful for you.
And so I would like immediately want to adopt it, obviously, right? Because it makes my job easier. Like, is that kind of the hope, or like, I guess? Well, I'll let you answer that question first.
Yeah, I think if you've written a Webpack loader or plugin, or if you've like written a Gulp plugin before, then you have an idea of like how the tooling interacts with other tooling, and then yeah, you would immediately understand that. There are several reasons that Bazel constrains each of the tools to be layered correctly so that the entire build can be incremental and parallelizable on a remote build farm.
So then tell me a little bit about, open source strategy. So let's say you see libraries out there like, let's say, like, is the goal really to make a big push in open source and start getting, let's say like Vue and React start using Bazel? Like, would that be a win?
Yes.
Is it smaller libraries? Is it?
If we make Bazel succeed for Angular users, then it will be. It could easily be the next build system for everybody. Sure. So like there was Grunt, and then there was Gulp, and then maybe next is Bazel. Every few years, the JavaScript ecosystem seems willing to adopt a whole new toolchain. We're happy to be the next one. Maybe we could be the last one. I think we have that ambition to a small degree. The Angular team isn't sort of staffed to replace the tooling of the entire ecosystem, and so it's not necessarily our immediate goal. We just want to make the thing good enough to satisfy large Angular users. But our team is also like making sure that the thing works with React and Vue, and then we're going to do at least a small scale example of those things, and then I hope that the ecosystem picks it up from there and starts to pave more of those last miles into other frameworks.
I kind of like to look at it as, if you think about, Travis, when they first started, they would just go and, submit a PR and be like, check it out. Look how amazing it is now. Don't you want Travis implemented into your project, right? Like, is that one of Bazel's ambitions to just kind of be like, hey, look how amazing this is? Ta-da!
I mean, yes, we want to impress people. No, I don't think we're planning to send pull requests to convert repos to Bazel. I don't think we have enough time. Obviously, we want to document that better so that it is easier for somebody else to send PRs and say, look how amazing. I just reviewed one today where an open source repo that's maintained by someone at Google, he's like, hey, look, I converted to Bazel. Does this look right? So there's some amount of sort of grassroots adoption by having it appear in more places and giving more exposure. But I don't think that's not the critical need today. The critical need, like I said, is for these enterprise use cases. So that's where we're spending at least my team is spending most of our time.
That makes sense. And then when you're using Bazel, do you kind of have to use the all or nothing, or can you use like the bits and pieces that you want out of Bazel that, can you use it incrementally, or do you kind of have to adopt the entire thing?
So, I mean, imagine you were, well, I don't know if that's a good way to explain it. Bazel is just a program that you run that then runs other programs. So it's like an orchestration layer. So one answer is you could take your existing build and then just have, in this one step where you're calling your old tool, you would call Bazel, and then Bazel calls your old tool. Or you could flip it around, and you could put Bazel at the root, and you could have, you start by running Bazel, but then it just does one step, which is to run your existing tool. And so, and then you would start to peel things out of that one step at a time. So yeah, there are incremental adoption strategies. I think it's important to profile your existing tooling to understand what is slow and what slow work happens every time, even though it doesn't need to. And then those are the things you want to pull out and make incremental first. But yeah, for sure, you can mix and match.
Okay, that's super interesting. Okay, awesome.
So I should explain that, like, the magic of Bazel making your build fast, parallelizable, and able to run remotely on a huge fleet of machines comes at a cost, and the cost is that Bazel needs to understand the dependency graph. If you were to look inside of your TypeScript sources, let's say, you have import statements, and that gives you some sense of the import graph between your files. But we don't want to compile every file in isolation. So what we want is a slightly higher level graph that says, in order to build my TypeScript code, you need all the following things from NPM. I installed @type/node and @type/polymer or something, and then you need all my TypeScript files. And by the way, one of my TypeScript files references this JSON file, so you need that too. Somebody has to tell Bazel, gather up all of these files. These are all of the inputs to running TypeScript. If any of them changes, then we need to rerun TypeScript because the result might be different. And then Bazel can take all of those inputs and it can calculate a checksum. And that checksum is what it uses for cache hits. And so it says, oh, those inputs, I've already done that work. I already know, if given those exact inputs, I already know what the result is. And so that's how the caching works. And then when Bazel takes, and then you tell it, okay, and then after you've run TypeScript, these are the outputs you're going to get on the disk. And so that means Bazel is a little bit like an inference engine, where you just give it some instructions, and it's like, if the user wants this, you can get it from this other thing. Like user wants X, so you can get it from Y if you run tool A. And then if the user wants Y, you can get it from Z by running tool B. And you just tell Bazel, these little individual, if you want this, you can construct it from that. And then it's Bazel's job to figure out, okay, so if what I need to do is build your final bundle and push it to production, that means I need to run the TypeScript compiler, and then I need to run the Sass compiler, and then I take the results of those, and I run them through a bundler, and then that needs to go through Trsor, and then that needs to go into my Kubernetes setup. And so there's no one place that you as the user tell Bazel the whole chain of things to do for your build, test, and deploy. You just tell it for each unit, given these inputs, here's how to make these outputs. That's it. And then it constructs a graph of okay, so then those outputs need to flow into the next thing's inputs. And so by expressing that graph to Bazel, now it understands how to do things remotely because it knows all the inputs it needs to copy to some machine in order to run some step of your build. And it knows I don't need to rerun this step because the inputs haven't changed. It knows I can cache these things. And so as a developer, you can even get a cache hit from your CI where it just did a build an hour ago ahead, and so most of the artifacts that you need to build are already a cache hit, and so you just fetch them. So I think it's important to be honest that Bazel doesn't do this stuff for free. It's because there is a dependency graph in your application that somebody can explain to Bazel, and then the question is just who explains it and how. Today, there's a fair amount of you would configure this dependency graph in your directory by adding a file called build. It just says, like, given these inputs, run TypeScript on them. So it's not very much configuration. But there is a section there where you list your dependencies. And so it's critical that Bazel understands the dependency structure in order to be fast and incremental.
So another question would be, if I as a developer want to start using Bazel, what is the best way to get started?
It depends. I mean, you can run, if you just want to play with Bazel, you just want to, like, try this thing out that I'm describing. The best way to get started is yarn create at Bazel. Or if you don't like yarn, you can run npm init at Bazel. And then that will create you a new directory that's already set up. And there's some flags that like when you run that, it'll print the command line help, and there's some flags you can use, so like add TypeScript optionally. And so that's the super simple on-ramp, just to, like, I use that a lot to make a repro if somebody says that there's a bug, and then I can easily just, like, make a little new application that builds with Bazel out of the box. But that's not really useful if you have the problem of a big enterprise application and you want to opt into it. That's a whole different migration strategy kind of question. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think that there's a whole industry that will grow up around consulting around Bazel to help enterprises do that.
Yeah. So what is, like, your, I mean, I know what I tell Angular people when they tell, how do you migrate from AngularJS to Angular? Well, let's talk about the things you don't do. But when it comes to Bazel, like, what are the sort of, like, the first things you tell people? What are the best ways to get started when they're doing a large migration, or not a large migration, but an integration? Or are we just not there yet?
In practice, a lot of I think in practice today, the first step is to understand a little bit about how Bazel works. It's hard to do this migration if you don't have sort of this, like, it's a different concept of the, like, the way the execution occurs is not imperative. You don't tell Bazel what to do. And so if you're used to writing build scripts that says do this and then do this and then do this, that doesn't appear anywhere. Mm-hmm. So having the right mental model is important. And then I think the next step, if you're a big app, is, like I said, profile it and understand where, like, what the structure of the build looks like, and then insert, like, as your first step, you want to insert Bazel in a place that helps you. So there's a company that's been adopting Bazel, and they're working on a white paper that I hope we can release soon, like maybe around the time of Angular Connect. And their approach was, first they migrated the unit tests for all of their libraries to Bazel. And that was because it sped up their CI a lot, because those could all run in parallel. And since those are the unit tests for their libraries, it's not on the critical path for build and deploy to production. It's just for tests. And it's all these leaves of the application, since it's all the different libs. And so that was sort of the lowest amount of investment required in order to get a tangible benefit in their CI turnaround time, such that they could go back to management and say, we spent a small amount of time, it's already beneficial, we should leave this in place, and then it should grow over time. And then the question would be like, okay, well, what system is adjacent to the stuff that's already in Bazel and would therefore benefit from being incremental and running immediately before or after the stuff that's already Bazel? And then I imagine that this grows, like the bubble that's already migrated into Bazel would grow over time. Another prototype you can look at is what we did in Angular to migrate to Bazel, and in that case, we actually started with our definitive NPM packages first. We built them, and then we made some Bazel stuff, and then we built that, and then we did a diff, and then I sat there for, like, weeks with the two diffs side by side until I got them the same. We did the same thing for Zone.js, which we migrated to Bazel just a month or two ago. So you can look through the commit history on the Zone.js repo. And that was similar, where it was, let's start with the production bundles, because that was the thing that was holding us back, because in that case we wanted to build production bundles to test them, and so that was the biggest return, was to migrate those first. There's also a really cool talk that you might want to check out from BazelConf, the first year of BazelCon, which was, I guess, 2016, from SpaceX. And they, like, launched a lot of rockets, so they care about their software being right, because, like, every time they lose a rocket, I guess it costs them money. And people on the space station are sad because some of their, like, personal treasures that were being sent up are like now little bits of ash floating in the atmosphere. So what SpaceX did is they did their original build and they recorded the exact command lines and the exact input hashes of everything that happened in their existing build. And then when they ported to Bazel, they made those things identical, like all the way down to this like C++ compiler, what libraries are being brought in. And so that, like, for them, it was important to be rigorous about Bazel cannot change our build. It can only be incremental, right? So when it does work, it needs to do it the same as before. It should just be skipping work a lot of the time.
Those are some really, really good data points on things to check out, and kind of, that was like 4 or 5 different ones, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I know that Bazel is, language agnostic, and I know that there's been a lot of push, obviously, in the Angular community to get it adopted, and adopted and everything. But when you look at, I guess Polymer and Vue and React and these other libraries, do you see any sort of issues that they may run into that Angular may not have, or other things that might need to happen that Angular needed to do to adopt it if you are doing something in React and or Vue and or Polymer?
I don't think there's anything structurally missing. Like somebody needs to write the little bit of glue that tells Bazel how to go shell out to these tools. So like we've been talking about doing this with Stencil. I think Svelte would be a really interesting one to do soon, because there's not that much tooling to run, and also because we already have pretty close integration with Rollup. So no, I think it's just a matter of somebody who has I think I've also talked to somebody who works on Preact about trying this out. At some point, I tweeted back at Dan Abramoff that I would Bazel his thing. Unfortunately, he never responded, so I didn't actually have to do that. So no, I think that part's pretty easy and fun.
Cool, awesome, cool. Okay, well, thank you.
I guess the other thing I do want to add one other thing, which is that each of these frameworks, like if you're an end user of one of these frameworks, use the tooling that they give you, right? So if you're using React, you probably run Create React App. That sets up a bunch of stuff for you that you don't understand and you shouldn't have to understand. And if you do that next year and the thing that it sets up that you don't understand has Bazel in it, then that's fine by you, right? And so I think the adoption won't come from end users necessarily. It will come from the next generation of CLI tools that come from frameworks, where they have to make a choice about some tool chain that they're gonna shrink wrap up for their users. And Bazel doesn't have the ambition of being an end user tool in that way. In the same way that Webpack is, like, sure, anybody could use Webpack on their own, but most people end up using it through something that's shrink wrapped and sets it up for you. So I think Bazel is going to be a similar model. So it'll be an infrastructure provider to the most, like the early adopters.